Good morning, gentlemen, and once again, welcome to Christian Vocation. Last time we talked, we were discussing matrimony and the unitive and procreative dimensions of human sexuality, and the way in which these fit together, incidentally. The Catechism talks about how the purpose of matrimony is the good of spouses and the education of children, the raising of children. These dimensions of human sexuality really are the complements, the foretastes of these elements of matrimony. So when we talk about the good of spouses, we do very much mean their union, a reuniting of what we had discussed yesterday of two things that had been separated. And the propagation of children, the procreation of children, obviously goes into the education and raising of children. And from there, also the formation of children. So then today, given that the way in which the spouses unite one another is something which naturally tends towards the raising of children, we're going to talk about marriage and family today, marriage and children today, and then conclude by sort of tying together what it is that we can see about human sexuality. So with that, let's start talking about one of those great gifts of any marriage, children. Really, one of the most fundamental claims that the Catholic Church makes about human life is that the proper context of the beginning of human life should be the committed expression of marital love, where a man and a woman united in marriage, united in that bond that makes them able to say, if we get pregnant, if we have a child, we can handle this together. This is ultimately the proper context for the beginning of human life. And what this also means is, remember what we've been saying about how eros is essentially a recognition of beauty, a twofold recognition of beauty. One of the other things that the Catholic Church is saying is that the ideal origin of every human life is an expression of beauty and an expression of love. And to the extent that the language of the body is expressing something truthful when a man and a woman give themselves to one another in an unreserved and married way. Truth, beauty, truth, goodness, love, all of these things. The Catholic Church is saying this is the best and most proper context for the beginning of any human life. And any time that the Catholic Church has a critique about a particular way in which human life might exist in relationship to sexuality, it is all about preserving that ideal. Now, one thing I do want to underscore absolutely and unequivocally, when we say that this is the proper context for the beginning of human life, what we do not mean is that any child who is born in some other context is less than human. Obviously, of course, all human beings have an infinite and equal dignity by virtue of being made in the image and likeness of God. No matter who you are, no matter what your origins in life, you are beloved of God. So when we make these critiques, we do have to draw a very sharp, very clear line. We are only critiquing the people who bring that life into existence in an improper way. It has absolutely nothing to do with the dignity of an individual who was brought about in, let's say, a less than ideal manner. So what would be ways in which that human life and human sexuality might be separated from one another? Ultimately, the Catholic Church says there are two ways in which this can be denied. The first is perhaps the more intuitive one, artificial contraception. What artificial contraception does is it removes the good of procreation from the expression of human sexuality, from the expression of love between a man and a woman. And this is an issue. Remember that when we talk about moral evil, we are saying, I willfully choose to remove this good from the equation. So that Oedipus blinding himself, for instance, choosing that, this is a moral evil. Well, with artificial contraception, effectively, what you have is the equivalent of Oedipus blinding himself. You have an individual saying, I am going to destroy my reproductive system, or either temporarily or permanently. I'm going to put it out of whack so that it is not able to do what it is supposed to do, so that this good is now removed. The other way in which it can be denied is artificial reproduction. This is sort of the flip side to this. So just as the Catholic Church says, every act of human intimacy must be open to the gift of life. So too, all human life should ideally come from that expression of human intimacy. And so things like in vitro and in vivo fertilization would absolutely be denials of this origin, so that human life no longer begins in this expression of love, but is begun in a laboratory, a somewhat more sterile environment, absent that truth, that beauty, that goodness, that love that is properly expressed in the marital embrace, in that expression of human sexuality. In both cases, you have in some way, shape, or form a separation of the transmission of human life from the expression of conjugal love. Again, this is not to say that a test tube baby is less than human. What it is saying is this is a less than ideal beginning to a human life. And one of the difficulties we can also see then is also with how do we begin to view human life if we think that it is something whose beginnings we can control? This is always one of the fundamental questions of virtue ethics, where you are what you repeatedly do. The way in which we constantly act and interact on the world and on ourselves, it shapes the way in which we look at human life. It shapes the way in which we look at the world in general. So that we begin to have a sense of, I can control the origins of human life. And when human life has an origin that is maybe inconvenient to me, then perhaps it is something that can be done away with. Planned Parenthood v. Casey, a case that occurred in the 90s, for instance, shows us the fruits of what happens when we get so used to separating human life from the expression of human intimacy. In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the Supreme Court said one of the reasons why the Supreme Court chose to uphold abortion was because we have become so used to using abortion as a backup case for when contraception fails. We have become so used to the idea that human sexuality and the beginnings of human life have nothing to do with one another, so that we are even willing, if the case happens, we are even willing to take human life in order to maintain that pleasant illusion that human life and human intimacy really do have nothing to do with one another. With artificial reproduction, we can then ask ourselves, what does this do to my view of human life when I think it is something that I can bring about whenever I please? There was a case that was occurring last fall where a number of individuals began to sue a sperm bank under lemon laws. Lemon laws are laws that prevent, most especially car dealerships and other people, from selling defective products. These women were trying to sue a sperm bank under lemon laws as though their children were a defective product, on the claim that the sperm that they had received gave their child a predisposition to autism and that their children were in fact autistic. Meanwhile, of course, the autistic community is sitting right there saying, hey, we can see you with this lawsuit. We're standing right here. Nice to see you too. Glad you're so happy for our existence. We begin to view human life in this commodified form the more and more we get used to this notion of artificial reproduction. And it degrades human existence and sometimes the various complexities of human existence in so many ways. And so that we ultimately say, this is a product, I have paid for my product, and I want that perfect product, except no substitutes. So that these denials really do have very practical implications for how it is that we see the world, how it is that we see human life, and how it is that we interact with one another and individuals who are maybe a little bit different from the rest of us. Ultimately, one of the things that we want to affirm is that human life is a fundamental good and that children are a blessing from the Lord. Human life, even when the individual may look disabled, may look disfigured in some way, frightening in some way, we still affirm it is good for you to be alive. And that is also one of the most fundamental ways in which we can say, I love you. The German philosopher Joseph Pieper said once that the saying, I love you, is another way of saying, I am glad that you are here. If we are called to love all of our neighbors, every person, then we are called to say to every single individual that exists, I am glad that you are here. I love you. Wonderful. It is welcome that you are here. It is a good thing. It is a good thing that you are here. And that children are likewise a blessing from the Lord, even if they come from impoverished situations, even if they may seem less than ideal. Now, What do we mean when we say children are a blessing from the Lord? This can seem like some sort of a trite saying. One of the things that we mean, first of all, is that children are a good, and they're a good which enrich our own lives. And children do enrich the lives of married couples and of all of us in so many ways. One of my friends was reflecting on one occasion about how it is that his children spurred him to be a better individual. He once told me there is nothing more terrifying than looking at your son, wondering where he got that bad habit, and then realizing he is mirroring your vices. His son, as he sees his son act out the bad things that he does, he is challenged to grow more and more and to become a better individual. His children make him want to be a better man, a better husband and father, and just a better Christian in general. And the same is true with his wife. His children, in that regard, are a blessing from the Lord and are an essential part of his vocation, an essential part of how it is that he learns to love. As I record today, it is March 21st, which is World Down Syndrome Day. Now, the reason why it's World Down Syndrome Day is because Down syndrome is also known as trisomy 21, where the 21st gene is replicated an extra time. And so instead of a pair, you've got three. And today is 3/21. So 21, 21, 21, instead of just 21, 21. He was reflecting on this day and said that the three children with Down syndrome that he has adopted, they have enriched his life and taught him how to love in ways he never would have thought possible. That they have taught him new meanings of patience and ways in which that he can grow. His children have revealed to him again his weaknesses. So that as we talk about how children are a blessing from the Lord, we say that even children with genetic deformities, even children with mental difficulties, even children who are different from the rest of us, these children too, are a blessing from the Lord and a fundamental good. And one of the things that this means, as Woodrow Wilson reminds us, provision for others is a fundamental responsibility for human life. All life must be welcomed, not only by the married couple, not only by the mother and father, but by society as a whole. And this is something that we're going to be talking about tomorrow when we talk about families and the relationship between societies and families. But one thing we do have to remember, always, 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 it is not enough just to say, you're the mother, you're the father, you take care of those kids. Children are about all of us. Children are about the natural law. It is about the human life, the human race propagating itself as the natural law tells us. All of us have a role to play in the propagation of the human race. All of us have a role to play in the propagation and the raising of children and giving the parents the support that they need, even if their children are disabled, even if their children are a little bit different from the rest of us. All of us have a responsibility to help parents look at their child and say, I am glad that you exist. Now, with all of this, it is indeed sometimes the case that prudence suggests sometimes a couple may avoid having children. In Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, he lists a number of reasons, including perhaps financial hardships, psychological difficulties, or it could be the case that if the woman were to get pregnant, there's a very real chance the pregnancy would be deleterious, detrimental to her health. These are realities. If this is the case, there are one of two options that the church allows, and that the natural law in general allows. First of all, they can abstain from sexual relations. And ultimately, if things are really 100% certain, there is no way in which you can get pregnant without dire circumstances happening, dire things happening. Really, this is the only option. There is no other way to make 100% certain, unless you want to begin saying some human life can be disposed of. There is no other way of saying we are 100% certain that pregnancy will never occur. It is a difficult thing sometimes, to be sure, but sometimes it is a necessary thing that we say that the married couple should abstain from sexual relations. The other possibility is that a couple may make use of the body's natural fertility cycles in order to regulate childbirth. We see here an image of the book, The Sinner's Guide to Natural Family Planning, written by the author Simcha Fisher. It's a very good book. Miss Fisher she is refreshingly honest sometimes about the challenges and the struggles that go along with the great joys and blessings that come from practicing natural family planning. And this can occur in a variety of ways. We see there the Billings ovulation method, Billings, Creighton, Marquette. There are many ways which make use of some of the best of modern science to say, this is when I am less than fertile. These are my infertile periods. Unlike artificial contraception, there are two major differences. One, and probably the most important major difference, there is no deliberate removal of a good that ought to be there. What we are simply recognizing is this is how the body is right now. And just as it's not a sin for a couple to engage in intimate relations when the woman is at any time, even if the woman is not necessarily in her fertile period, so we say sometimes it's morally acceptable for the couple only to engage in intimate relations in moments when the woman is not necessarily in her most fertile of states. This is simply, we're making use of what is already the case in the natural order, rather than imposing some kind of a new order or removing things on our own from this natural order. And the second and most important difference is that the couple still remains receptive to the good of life. We recognize that instead of being the masters of nature and masters of the natural order, we are its servants, and we are working in rhythm, in synchronicity with the natural order. There's a symbiosis rather than an attempt to dominate. And so the couple, as they do this, they must always remain receptive to the good of life, if prudence suggests that having children is maybe something that's not prudent at that particular time. And below here you see an image that Ms. Fisher took with one of her daughters reading The Sinner's Guide to Natural Family Planning. Ms. Fisher, an advocate of natural family planning, is herself also very much open to new life as it occurs. Wrapping things up and having some final reflections on human sexuality in general. Ultimately, when the purpose of sexuality is actively thwarted, when I make actions, concrete steps in order to remove some good that ought to be present from the equation, this is when sexual activity becomes sinful and an offense against chastity. When you take a look at the catechism readings, offenses against matrimony and offenses against chastity, again, this is why in both cases the catechism begins with a reflection on this is the ideal of matrimony, this is the ideal of chastity. And then once we have the ideal established, there are ways of removing elements from that ideal. This is always the problem. Whenever we're thwarting the purpose of sexuality and keeping it from being the good and wonderful thing that God has created it to be. This goes back to the idea of evil is a deprivation of a good that ought to be there and works against its telos. Something as well to bear in mind as we talk about sexuality and ways of offending against sexuality are two great, horrible, but great examples of individuals and groups that fail to respect human sexuality and fail to live out sexual morality. In the upper corner there, we see Judge Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as he is in his song from the musical, that Disney musical, Hellfire, which I would dare to say is probably one of the greatest villain songs in any Disney musical, any Disney movie, period. What Judge Frollo is singing there in his song Hellfire, oh, it's not my fault. All of these desires are in me. I can't do anything about it. And so if I can't have her, I'm going to kill her. This is always something to bear in mind. Whenever we have sexual desires, they occur. It's part of being human. They are not our masters. Ultimately, our physical element, as we have seen with Genesis 1 and 2, the physical element is a very real part of who we are, but it is not the only part, and it is not the highest part. Our sexual desires must be kept in line with reason, must be kept in line with the larger order of creation. Judge Frollo really is an embodiment. When we forget that, when we think, oh, sexual desire is just something that happens to me and I can't control myself. To be quite honest, gentlemen, this is how sexual assault happens. When rapists or harassers say, oh, she was dressed like that, she wanted it, it's not my fault. I was just out of control. How could you possibly blame me? There she was, showing perhaps a little bit of shoulder. No, gentlemen, this is unacceptable. Sexual desire is always something that we must keep ordered within the bounds of reason and within the bounds of good morality. Judge Frollo is a perfect example of an individual who forgets that and uses that as an excuse to simply live however he wants. Down there in the bottom corner, we can see another great example. This is William Blake's painting depicting Dante's circle of hell for the lustful. In Dante's Inferno, he depicts the lustful as individuals who are blown about in whirlwinds every which way because they keep on claiming, oh, it's not my fault. I can't possibly control myself. My desires just got the better of me. They have allowed that lustful desire to be their masters rather than being the masters of their own sexuality. And so Dante thought that the fitting punishment, just as they were blown this way and that by the desires of lust, so too they would be caught up in whirlwinds forever in hell, always at the desire of whims, always at the desires of lusts and other things that were purely beyond their control. A life in eternity without any kind of control over the direction you get. What a hellish existence. We want to rise above that always. We want to become the individuals who are masters of our sexuality, who are masters of our embodied existence. Never giving that example of, or never giving that excuse rather of, it's not my fault, it's out of my control. Our bodies and our very selves are always part of our control. And it is our job to look at the order of nature and say, I will unite myself to this great order. I will become part of the great, beautiful order of nature and live in accordance with those values. One thing that we've hopefully seen today is that human sexuality is a wonderful gift from the Lord. Used properly, it can lead to some truly great joys. It can lead to the blessings of family. It can lead to the blessings of children. Children who can enrich our lives, who can help us to live out our vocations more fully by making us the individuals that God has called us to be, and make us grow in holiness as we recognize our obligations to others and are simply inspired by our children to become the Christians that God has made us to be, to become the people that God has made us to be. What we have also seen, however, is that when misused, the gift of sexuality can also have some dire consequences for our souls and for how we look at the world. Do not succumb to lesser views of human sexuality. Do not listen to the world when it says your sexuality is stronger than you. We are always the masters of ourselves through the grace of God, through the help of God. Tomorrow, we're going to continue to talk about families, families in themselves, families as they relate to the larger societies, and how it is that families are building blocks of society and of the church. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen, and don't subject yourself to the hellfire.